Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, August 2nd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the Kamala Harris for President campaign, raising a massive $310 million in the month of July, doubling the Donald Trump campaign that raised just under $150 million. Now, this massive fundraising haul makes the biggest mark in fundraising history for any presidential candidate ever. Hillary Clinton had a very massive sprint heading into the election, doing very well, fundraising $60-70 million, breaking records at that point in time. Then came 2020 when Joe Biden and Donald Trump, in different cases, were raising $100 million plus in individual months and doing really well in the lead up into the election. But Kamala Harris raising $310 million in July breaks a fundraising record at any point in time during the campaign history. And right now, what we're looking at is that Kamala Harris's campaign starts with a huge cash-on-hand advantage against the Donald Trump campaign in a way we haven't seen in the past 6 months. Donald Trump has pretty consistently, in the past 3 months, the entirety of the summer, been outpacing Joe Biden in his campaign. Following the guilty verdict, Donald Trump raised $141 million, which actually is more money than he raised in the entire month of July. And a lot of it was boosted by the guilty verdict. On the final day of the fundraising stretch in May, Donald Trump was found guilty, 34 counts of felonies, in which his campaign saw nearly $100 million rushed in just under 24 hours. It was very similar to what we saw when Kamala Harris announced her bid for the presidency, but it was continuous. In over a week long, Kamala Harris raised $200 million in the first week of her campaign. Now, Donald Trump's fundraising numbers this month were actually pretty high compared to previous months for the Trump campaign. What we have seen is that Donald Trump has done a really good job at turning circumstances into moneymakers for the campaign. When he was found guilty, he raised over $100 million as a result of that guilty verdict. After the presidential debate, he tried to counter Joe Biden's fundraising numbers, and sure, he didn't meet the mark, but he still fundraised a lot despite having a very strong debate performance, which in theory wouldn't make people more likely to donate because of the fact that they believe their candidate is on track to win. But this past month, I think, has been the real show of how money in Donald Trump's side doesn't actually work the way that it used to, especially after the guilty verdict. Because in the month of July, Donald Trump arguably had a lot of things that happened that would have generated a lot of media attention and arguably a lot of numbers in terms of the fundraising lens. On one end, he survived an assassination attempt. Many Republicans had taken to Twitter and talked about political violence, but equally talked about how this day would be the best fundraising day in presidential election history. But it was surprising when the Trump campaign did not announce their numbers the next day. It's very typical for a campaign to announce their numbers at the end of the month, but more importantly, when things happen that are huge. For instance, when Donald Trump was found guilty, the Donald Trump campaign was immediate in talking about how much money they raised that evening. They talked about how much money was going into Win Red and Republicans across the country, and specifically to Donald Trump. It was a big deal because they were raising a crap ton. But this time, in July, Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt, named his running mate, and had an entirety of programming off a 4-day Republican National Convention, only to raise $138.7 million, $3 million less than what he raised in May. It's even more impressive for the Kamala Harris campaign that they raised $310 million this month. It means that they've completely obliterated Donald Trump's fundraising advantage that he had in May and June, and arguably almost all of July, until Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee for president. When Joe Biden dropped out of the race, that pace that Democrats were at, they were losing donors because people were losing confidence in Joe Biden. They were losing enthusiasm because people were losing confidence in Joe Biden. And so a lot of what we saw there was that on the fundraising end, while they did raise about $40 to $50 million in the immediate aftermath of the presidential debate, it simply was not enough to counteract the $100 million advantage that Donald Trump had from the previous months over Joe Biden. But when she decided that she was going to run for president and Joe Biden decided that he was going to leave the race, Democrats raised a crap ton. I mean, you were talking in just under 24 hours, completely obliterating the amount of money that Donald Trump had raised against Kamala Harris. And also now we see that at the end of the month, the Harris campaign raising over $300 million marks the most successful month in Democratic Party history for fundraising, on top of the fact that Kamala Harris coming into this with just 12 days of a campaign, very impressive. So Harris's campaign also raising this money certainly has implications for an election like this one. I'm reminded about back in 2020. Joe Biden, Donald Trump, in the day and age of digital ads and, COVID-19, people were at home. Not as much money spent on rallies, more money spent on TV ads, more money spent on YouTube ads, more money spent elsewhere. In this election, it was the most expensive race that we had seen in U.S. history. What we found here was that across the presidential candidates, nearly $4 billion was raised across outside groups, small groups, small donations, whatever it might be. $4 billion were raised in the 2020 presidential election. Joe Biden raised about $1 billion from candidate committee money. So you're talking DNC, you're talking about, his campaign for the presidency, and then $580 million raised. This includes things like super PACs and groups that give a lot of money and, advocate on behalf of President Biden. That was around $1.5 billion raised in that election. Donald Trump also raised roughly $1 billion himself. The big thing on this all is that Donald Trump raising roughly $1 billion for just, focusing on his election, because we actually saw that in 2020, it was a very expensive election, largely because of the fact that congressional races raised over $8 billion across them, $8 billion spent in congressional races in the 2020 election. It is insanity. We reached $13 billion for the 2020 election in entirety. But looking back at this point for the presidential race, Joe Biden raising $1 billion on candidate committee money goes to show that this time around, Kamala Harris already came in with Joe Biden raising over $300 million, a huge amount of money over the past 6 months, a very, very big fundraising haul. We saw individual evenings where Joe Biden was raising $25 million at just one fundraiser. And so Biden and the Democratic Party were arguably in a good point until Donald Trump's conviction, until he was able to reverse that. And so up until that point, Democrats had actually been riding high. They had been counting on a cash-on-hand advantage going into the election, and that would actually build the momentum for Biden to win. Now, Democrats have that cash-on-hand advantage and still have that momentum there to win, and now can use that cash-on-hand advantage to build out that momentum. Joe Biden, again, raised $1.5 billion, and in terms of candidate committee money, which is what we're talking about here when we say the Kamala Harris for President campaign raises $300 million, that means Kamala Harris, in just 1 month, raised a third of what Joe Biden raised in the 2020 presidential election. 1/3 of what Joe Biden raised in the 2020 presidential election. That matters. That is huge for the Democratic Party because it means they will likely have more money in this election than they did in 2020. An election that had record-breaking turnout. I mean, you can see back in 2020, you may not have felt it, but in 2020, it was the highest turnout we had seen since the election of 1900. Not in the 1900s, but literally 1900, before the Titanic set sail. That was the last time voter turnout was this high. And so Joe Biden and Donald Trump combined in their efforts brought voter turnout to 67% nationwide. Massive amounts of funding in a race. Hillary Clinton, in the month of July, to put things into perspective too, raised under $70 million. In her biggest fundraising haul that we had seen in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton fundraised less than $70 million. In July of 2024, 8 years later, Kamala Harris is at $310 million. Over 4 times what Hillary Clinton fundraised. And I believe the number was actually more around 61, so nearly more than 5 times the amount that Hillary Clinton fundraised in her best performing month up until this point, which was in fact July, just to put things into perspective. This election is very different than any of its predecessors. What was originally a rematch to a dropping out of an incumbent vice president to a moving up of an incumbent vice president to Donald Trump, who had an incumbent vice president in 2020, who no longer wants to run with him and won't endorse him, so he has to choose a new vice president. It's a very, very new election, and one that will be largely driven by the money that is in this race as it pertains to advertisements, messaging, strategy, rallies. You need money to make a campaign work, and it is clear that Kamala Harris has it in a way that Donald Trump does not. And while Donald Trump has a large amount of money, they say the cash on hand is at $327 million. Democrats say their cash on hand is about $50 million more. That matters because it also isn't going to end here. Kamala Harris is going to announce a VP pick, and they're going to raise a lot more money. The convention has yet to happen, and they're going to raise a lot more money. The first debate has yet to happen, and they're going to raise a lot more money. The good news for Donald Trump, all of those good moments that should have built up an amazing July haul, absolutely did not. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that $138 million isn't a lot of money. If I could get that today, I would take it, right? Anyone would. But at the same time, any candidate too. At the same time, it is all about comparison. That is all and anything this election has ever been. Comparison, comparison, comparison. Juxtaposing the two candidates against each other. And again, Donald Trump has gotten all of his free press. Donald Trump has gotten all of his free media. From here on out, for Donald Trump, there's no more conventions. There's no more real debates besides the one debate where he probably isn't going to win. And of course, there's a VP debate, but J.D. Vance, I'm sure you've seen thus far, is far from a star candidate. And so Republicans really don't have much to look forward to over the next 90 days until Election Day. That's a problem for the Trump team. Again, to put it into perspective, all Kamala Harris needed to do was say, I'm running for president, $310 million. Donald Trump had to survive an assassination attempt, had to announce his VP running mate after weeks and months of speculation, very public Veep stakes, and of course, 4 days of nonstop media coverage of the Republican National Convention. Speaker after speaker after speaker, the House Speaker, people from the Senate, members of Congress, Donald Trump himself, everybody spoke at that convention, all with calls to action. Send in money, let's win this election, let's beat Sleepy Joe. Then Sleepy Joe is no longer in the race. So it became a problem. But all of that happened. Everything in sequence. The debate aftermath. The debate was June 27th. We are literally a month and a week since that debate. I mean, this has felt like a year if you're watching this. I mean, I'm sure you can tell that this has taken years off my life. This whole election season, right? Not really, but like this whole election season has been a trip and a half. And so right now, what we're at, immediate aftermath of the debate, Donald Trump should have been doing really well, and he was doing really well. Should have done really well after the assassination attempt, was doing really well. The RNC was doing really well. And all it took was Kamala Harris to announce her bid for the presidency, and she out-fundraises him by over double. This is unlike anything I think I've ever seen in an election, even 2020, even 2016. This election is so entirely different, and the energy around Kamala Harris, and I know a lot of people use this as an example because I think it's true, feels very reminiscent of the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections. The crowds that Kamala Harris is turning out, the way she's campaigning. Hillary Clinton in 2016 did a campaign stop at most twice a day, but largely once a day, 5 times a week. Was still doing fundraisers in the lead up to the election. You can see the Washington Post, New York Times, all of them were tracking Hillary Clinton's travel in 2016. And what did it come up with? Not that many campaign stops. This time, Kamala Harris is doing a crap ton of campaign stops. She's going this upcoming week in a 4-day stretch, starting on Tuesday, ending on Friday. Where does she go? Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Then she goes to Western Wisconsin. Then she goes to Detroit, Michigan. Then she goes to Savannah, Georgia, Raleigh, North Carolina, Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada. The Democratic Party and Kamala Harris have built out a strategy of 7 battleground states. We talked about this in yesterday's video. 7 battleground states, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia, that they are going to be focusing on for this election. In 2020, this map included Florida. In 2020, this map included Iowa. In 2020, this map included Texas. And in 2020, this map included Ohio. And Democrats fell short in all 4 of those states, so they cut them and decided that those would no longer be the focus of this race and that Kamala Harris would not be doing practically any campaign stops except a few fundraisers in Texas, 1 or 2 stops in Florida to show face. But largely speaking, as we can see with this battleground swing state tour being led by her and her vice presidential nominee, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the Rust Belt, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, the Sun Belt. It's a 2-way strategy that has worked for Democrats before, will work for them again, and is on track to work for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. And now, she has the financial means of doing it in a way that Donald Trump does not. This is where Democrats get back on track. Because in the months leading up to the presidential debate, things looked far better for President Biden than they did in the aftermath of the debate. After the guilty conviction, sure, it may not have swayed the public in massive amounts, I do believe, and we did see that in some of the data we were looking at that showed that there were some swings amongst independent voters after the guilty verdict. It wasn't a completely disqualifying factor for Donald Trump. But the way the Kamala Harris campaign has now been positioning this election as a former prosecutor versus a convicted felon is something that seems to be resonating well with voters, resonating well with suburbanites, resonating well with minority voters, resonating well with all Americans. That isn't to say that Kamala Harris is going to have a 2008-style victory. I really think this election is going to come down to the narrowest of margins, regardless of who wins. But a month ago, under Joe Biden, Democrats were on track for a loss. A loss that showed Joe Biden at 226 electoral votes, underperforming John Kerry, underperforming Al Gore, underperforming Hillary Clinton, and even Donald Trump's performance in the last election, 226 votes. This time, Kamala Harris is on track for a very strong, very strong performance relative to Joe Biden's. Is it enough to have her win? Today, I say yes. November, I don't know. But Kamala Harris now has one thing that Joe Biden wasn't able to do in the aftermath of the debate, and that was massive amounts of grassroots fundraising, big donor fundraising. Everyone is excited on the Democratic side. They've completely fixed this enthusiasm problem that the Democrats have had for quite some time now. And Democrats seem to be very excited about this election, and so do the donors. The people with money are showing that they are all in for Kamala Harris in a way that Trump and his supporters are not. And so $138 million is a far fewer and smaller number than $310 million for Kamala Harris. She does a massive fundraising haul in no surprise to anyone. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.